Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. You may have noticed I've been on a bit of an 80s kick recently, but really, I'm just making up for lost time. My childhood was the 90s, where the trends of popular music, especially rock, were a pretty direct backlash against the excess of the 80s, and even though by the early 2000s we were right back at it with nu metal, that reputation stuck. To this day, in rock circles, the 70s were the golden age, the 90s were the big revival, and the 80s... well, the 80s just kinda happened in between. That was when we lost our way, and beyond maybe Guns N' Roses, we do our best not to talk about it. Which, sure, fine, but I have one small problem with that narrative. 80s music rules. It's great, even the rock stuff. And to prove my point, I'd like to look at one of the most quintessentially 80s rock songs ever written, Duran Duran's Hungry Like the Wolf. Let's take it apart. The song starts like this, with Andy Taylor's iconic guitar riff. This consists of two alternating parts. In the first bar, all we get is some quiet chugging and a pair of staccato power chord stabs. These stabs remind me of a rhythmic pattern called the Charleston, where you take evenly spaced beats, in this case beats 1 and 3, and play the second one a little bit early, giving you this strong pulse on the first beat and then a little syncopated bounce on the second. If he just played a normal Charleston pattern, it'd sound like this, which honestly also sounds cool, but instead of doing that, he delays the entire thing by an eighth note, pushing the start to an offbeat for more syncopation. This does push the second one back onto beat 3, but to my ears it still feels syncopated, likely because it's being compared in part to this initial offbeat attack. If this were beat 1, which it sounds like it wants to be, then this would be syncopated, so even though this isn't beat 1, that impression carries over. The end result is a pair of stabs that feel really disconnected from the underlying pulse, capturing the anxiety of the song's hunt. They're like snapping twigs in the forest, and you're a wolf, always at attention, reacting immediately to every sudden, unexpected noise. For the other half, he switches to a single note line. Here, we again see an echo of that Charleston rhythm in the positions of these two A's, but this time it's starting on the downbeat, and the space between is filled by other notes, so it's less obvious. Instead, I'd like to focus on the 3 notes in this lick because this is a really common melodic shape in guitar lines. I tend to think of it as the blister in the sun shape because that's where I first heard it, but it's kinda everywhere, and for good reason. It exists at a really powerful crossroads between the tonal language of Western music and the physicality of the guitar as an instrument. Let me explain. The top and bottom notes are a perfect fourth apart. This means they can be played on the same fret on 2 adjacent strings, in this case the second fret of the D and G strings. The middle note is a half step or a single fret below the top one, in this case the first fret of the G string. As such, you can play these 3 notes in any order, rhythm, and pattern you want using just 2 frets, 2 strings, and 2 fingers, pivoting around that G sharp with your index while your middle finger bounces back and forth between E and A. It's a comfortable, ergonomic movement that fits very naturally under a guitarist's fingers. But it also fits very naturally into rock music's tonal vocabulary because these 3 notes are the root, the major third, and the perfect fourth, almost like a scale in microcosm. The root is our primary reference point, giving us something to hear the other notes against. The third is a primary consonance, reinforcing the tonality of the key. And the fourth is a primary dissonance, creating instability by covering up the third. With just these 3 notes, a guitarist can explore almost infinite patterns of rest, tension, and release. And that's what makes the shape so powerful. It's not a specific lick, you're not bound to one pattern. The order you choose to put these notes in, and the parts you choose to emphasize rhythmically, can fundamentally change the impact. In Hungry Like the Wolf, he starts on the 4, emphasizing tension, then we get a quick release as he falls through the third and root before jumping back to 4 and hanging on it, ramping that tension even further. Other uses of the shape might have a more relaxed sound, emphasizing the more stable notes, but here he's leaning as hard as he can on the dissonance portion of this musical triforce. Together, these 2 bars create a really interesting dynamic of shifting tension. In the first bar, the notes are static, but the rhythm is sparse, jagged, and uneven. In the second, the rhythm gets denser and less complex, but now the melody is moving into a more dissonant space. Drawing on the hunting metaphor, we seem to be alternating between lying in wait tracking our prey and bursts of energy as as we run them down. We're never at rest, but it's not always the same kind of action. The situation changes and the riff changes with it. But this is 80s music, and like I said at the beginning, 80s music is all about excess and overwrought production. We can't just have a great riff, we need a bunch more layers underneath it, so let's look at what everyone else is doing, starting with keyboardist Nick Rhodes. Or, okay, Rhodes didn't actually play this. The part is sequenced, and randomly sequenced at that. The notes are all drawn from an E major triad spread out across roughly 2 octaves, but there's no pattern. It's a constant, unpredictable stream of beeps and boops. According to interviews, the band achieved this by connecting a Roland 808 drum machine and a sequencer to control a Jupiter 8 synth. But why? According to those same interviews, they were basically just messing around with the technology to see what they could do, but as for its purpose in the song, I think it's doing 3 things. First, it's laying down a harmonic bed. It's not a super clear statement of the harmony, but the chords don't change all that often, so you do have time to absorb all the different notes in each one. The riff is already establishing a static E major harmony, but this synth line helps to reinforce it. The second job is disorientation. There's a new note on every 16th, but not all notes are created equal. Some, like the high B and the low E, stand out for their relatively extreme ranges. This gives the pattern a natural ebb and flow, but because the notes are random, you never know when the next peak or valley is gonna happen. They just jump out at you, regularly enough that you know they're coming, but irregularly enough that you can't predict when. And the third job is probably the simplest. This constant stream of 16th notes is a constant stream of 16th notes. That's important because if we listen to Roger Taylor's drums, there's no hi-hat, he's just playing quarter notes on the kick and snare. We do eventually get hats in the chorus, but for now, it's not there. But in rock music, the hi-hat has a very specific job. It subdivides the beat into smaller units, explicitly defining the song's smallest rhythmic layer with a constant, unwavering pulse. Here, though, it's not around to do that, so in a way, this barrage of random synth tones is the song's hi-hat. It's too fast and too chaotic to provide much of a melody, so even though there are notes happening, functionally, it feels like percussion. But let's stick with Roger's drums for a second, because they're actually pretty interesting. They seem to be a combination of real and synthetic drum sounds. The main pattern is played on a normal kit, which you can tell because of the occasional crash cymbals. Drum synthesizers at the time didn't sound all that realistic, and early drum samplers didn't come with cymbals at all because the long fading tail wouldn't fit in their relatively limited memory banks. However, if we skip ahead a bit, we'll see that the tom fills aren't using real toms. Instead, these come from a Simmons SDS-5, an analog drum synthesizer that was playable like a real drum kit. In 80s pop music, a lot of bands went all in on synth or sampled drum sounds to give their music a sort of hyper-polished futuristic sheen, but Hungry Like the Wolf is a rock song, and the foundation of rock is the pounding aggression of a real drummer. Putting the basic groove on a physical kit creates the small fluctuations in time and timbre that indicate the presence of an actual person, while the over-the-top sound of those Simmons toms gives it the bombastic energy that defined the 80s. By combining the two approaches, Rogers gets to have the best of both worlds, playing a part that's both clearly human and so much more. That leaves us with John Taylor's bass, and here's the thing. I notated that wrong. Don't worry, bassists, I know I did it on purpose to prove a point. When I isolate the bass part like this, it's almost impossible for me not to hear this first attack as beat 1. You've got this clear Charleston rhythm in the first bar, strong hits on the downbeat of every bar, and then this little turnaround run at the end of each phrase to set up the start of the next one. To my mind, this is by far the most reasonable analysis of this rhythm, but it's wrong. Here, listen to it again and see if you can figure out where that first attack actually belongs. Any luck? Maybe you guessed that this was the 8th note after the downbeat? I mean, I mentioned the Charleston pattern, so it'd make sense if these two attacks lined up with the guitar stabs. But they don't. No, this note right here is on beat 2. Which is wild. The Charleston is delayed even more than it was in the guitar, but whereas Andy returned to the normal downbeat in the second bar of the riff, John keeps that delay going, starting the second bar on beat 2 as well. Honestly, even with the drums, my ears keep drifting back to hearing this as the downbeat. The rhythmic cues are so strong in this part that even the backbeat snare can't keep me grounded. It's only when I listen to it in the context of the full song that I can actually square this circle. So what's my point? Am I just trying to show off how bad I am at rhythm? Maybe. I don't know. Maybe it sounded like beat 2 to you the whole time, but I'd be willing to bet it didn't, which ties back to a recurring theme in this song: disorientation. There are two entirely reasonable, predictable ways for this bass part to line up with the music around it. It does neither of them. Instead, it fills the gaps after the chord stabs, which are themselves already off kilter, and then it does this little run that lines up with nothing and makes sense with nothing. And yet it all fits. Not in a clear one-to-one sort of way, but this lack of alignment plays into that same anxiety that so many other parts are building. The arrangement here is layers upon layers of chaos, and John's bass part just happens to be the most chaotic of all. That leads into the verse, which is over the same riff, so all we have to talk about here is Simon Le Bon's vocals.
Dark in the city, night is a wire.
He seems to be roughly mimicking the guitar riff. This run of high E's starts and ends on those two chord stabs before dropping down almost an octave.
Dark in the city.
So even though the line keeps going, it's pretty clearly following that same rhythm. In the second bar, he again copies the guitar rhythm, and he kinda copies the notes too. At least the first two are the same, going from A to G sharp. If he was perfectly mimicking the riff, he'd sing this.
Night is a wire.
But because he stops after the fourth note, that'd leave him hanging on a dissonance. Instead, after the G sharp, he turns around and walks up to B.
Night is a wire.
So he can end the line somewhere stable. It's kind of a compromise, but by starting the line the same way, he's able to make it sound close enough that unless you're listening carefully, it all just sort of fits. I suppose I could argue that this is another one of the song's disorientation effects, since the two melodic lines do end up a whole step apart, but I don't know, it all blends pretty well to me. The two instruments aren't similar enough timbres to sound like they're trying to harmonize. They're just two different takes on the same shape molded to fit their own rhythmic needs. And that's pretty cool. After a couple lines of that, we get our first change in harmony. Up to now, it's been mostly riff-driven, but the overall implication has been a static E major triad. The tag at the end of the verse drops down to D, the flat 7. I don't really have a lot to say about this. The flat 7 is a fairly standard sound in rock harmony, different enough from the one to provide some contrast, but still capable of providing a strong, satisfying resolution back to it. If you're gonna break up a long run of static harmony with another chord, the flat 7 is the right choice. So yeah, no real insight here, but the existence of this tag is gonna be really important once we get to the chorus, so I'm acknowledging it now so I can reference it later. That's called foreshadowing. Anyway, that brings us to the chorus. And I have to say something about these chords because I've been losing my mind here. When I'm working on these videos, I always try to get my transcriptions as accurate as possible to make sure the things I'm analyzing are the things that actually happen in the song. But I'm not perfect, so part of that process includes double-checking my work by looking up other transcriptions to see if they agree with me. And this time, I went deep. I looked up chord charts, tabs, I even watched a bunch of tutorial videos, and almost none of the sources I could find included this B-flat chord. According to the internet, this progression is a bar of C, a bar of G, then 2 bars of F. But, like, I have the stems. You can hear the move to B flat both in the guitar and the bass. So, what? Were my stems wrong somehow? Maybe I'd accidentally found someone else's recording and they just added in this extra chord for some reason? But no, I went back to the original track. And there's a B-flat chord there too. It's not hard to hear. What is happening? How did so many talented guitarists and transcribers get this wrong? Well, I have a theory. I blame Nick Rhodes. The chorus includes a new synth line, descending through chord tones to match the changing harmony, and while Andy and John both play the B-flat chord, this line doesn't. Rhodes hangs on an A until it's time to start over, at which point he walks back up through B natural. There's no indication in this synth part that we've changed chords. But why not? I can think of a couple reasons. First, he's walking down in steps, and there's no B-flat chord tone a step below A. In fact, A is a B-flat chord tone. It's the major 7th. Admittedly, it's a pretty spicy one, especially when most of the harmony is played as power chords, but it still counts, and it lets him keep the end of the line fairly close in range to the beginning so the loop feels smooth. I suppose he could have stepped up a half step to B-flat for this chord, but that would change the melodic trajectory, and he probably wants to save that move for later. But also, this line is pretty similar to Levine's vocals.
In touch with the ground, I'm on the hunt, I'm after you.
These start a little higher, but they're also moving down chord tones and steps, and this phrase only covers the first 3 bars. He does sing over the B-flat chord,
Smell like a sound.
but that's clearly a pickup into the next phrase, not a continuation of the last one. So if Rhodes is harmonizing Levine, and Levine stops after the 3rd bar, then it makes sense for Rhodes to stop moving as well. Either way, if you hear a fairly prominent A for 2 bars, and you know the first bar is an F chord, it does make sense to assume the second one is too. And it's a hard mistake to catch. Again, the guitar's playing power chords, and F5 and B-flat 5 aren't all that different. If you play one over the other, they're not going to clash, so if you're not listening super carefully, it's easy to miss that it's wrong. But it is. Please play the B-flat. It sounds so much better with the B-flat. Alright, with that out of the way, let's get back to the analysis. Why does it sound better with the B-flat? Well, let's consider the movement through the loop. We start on the root, go down a perfect 4th, or in guitar terms down a string, then down a whole step, up a string, and up a whole step. He's just moving around in a fun little circle. This leads to really smooth ergonomic motion, but it also creates strong harmonic motion with each chord driving into the next one. Now, we could still get that without the B-flat. F can resolve to C just fine. But stopping on the F chord for 2 bars kills the momentum, and adding the B-flat back in gives it a really satisfying symmetrical shape that makes the return to C feel way more satisfying. It's that same flat 7-1 thing we saw in the tag, just in a new key. Hold on. What? Oh yeah, did I not mention? We changed keys from E major in the verse to C major in the chorus. That's a pretty drastic shift. The 2 keys only have 3 notes in common, they share 0 chords, and it's not really prepared in any traditional way. This should be jarring. But it's not. Why not? Well, for starters, we've been playing kind of fast and loose with the idea of a key. I said the verse was in E major, but it's really just on that one chord. There's not a lot of strong cadences or anything that clearly establish the rest of the key. The only other chord we get is D, which isn't even in E major. We could say this means we're actually in E mixolydian, or we can say this chord is borrowed from E minor. I don't really care either way, I don't think it matters. What does matter is that most of the tonality is left undefined, and this D gets us used to the idea of hearing a flat 7, so when the chorus starts on C, it seems reasonable enough to hear it as a flat 6. The G could also fit as a flat 3, so it's not until they hit the F chord that it becomes clear we haven't just switched to E minor. Couple that with a strong F, B flat, C resolution chain at the end, and our new key is established with no clear, awkward boundary. And they also reinforce it in the melody. While E major and C major don't have many notes in common, one note they do share is E, so Levine helps cover the transition by starting on that note. From here, he steps down to D, which again, we're already used to hearing in the old key. This is starting to look a lot like the tag, where he started on E, then walked down the scale to B, the 5th, but instead, this time, he settles comfortably on C, the new root. It's not a direct copy of the tagline, but by taking some notes we're already used to with clear melodic implications and restructuring them into a classic 3-2-1 walkdown, Levine eases us into the new key without having to deal with all the potential clashes. That's the how, but what about the why? Why change keys here at all? And look, I know I'm going to sound like a broken record, but the answer is disorientation. They cover their tracks well enough that it's not immediately obvious what happened, but it's not like they don't want you to notice. Remember how I said the existence of the tag in the verse was going to be important in the chorus? This is why. I said the chorus loop was this, and it is, but every second time, instead of the B flat chord, they end with D major. And they really emphasize it too. The guitar switches from quietly strumming power chords to this big voicing of the full triad. The synth does a big leap up to D. and Laban joins him,
hungry like the wolf,
with a clear lyrical accent as well. This chord is a big deal, and that makes sense. We already heard it in the tag, but there it was the flat 7 resolving cleanly back to 1, whereas here it's... yeah, I don't know. I mean, if I'd seen this in my theory homework back in college, I'd probably call it a secondary dominant, but in this context, that feels like such a weak analysis that I'm not even gonna bother explaining what it means. More than anything, this feels like the band pointing out the key change after the fact, forcing the abrupt realization that you aren't where you thought you were. You're suddenly lost in unfamiliar surroundings, and this thing that used to make sense has transformed into something alien. The entire key change sets up this moment, and they're milking it for all it's worth. The only other thing we need to talk about is the breakdown, but I think you can guess what I'm gonna say here. It's all disorientation. Rogers drops out the backbeat snare and adds a 16th note hi-hat, removing the rhythmic compass and drowning you in a sea of undifferentiated beats punctuated with the occasional big Simmons tom. Andy abandons the rhythm, instead playing these long, wailing harmonic dives. That random synth part is also missing, so the only harmonic information comes from John's bass, which is providing a bit of an anchor by holding the same basic rhythm as the verses, but with occasional accent on the notes above and below the root. Sonically, it's a very dense section with a lot of things going on at once. It's hard to focus on any one piece. And at the center of it all is this thick, ragged breathing that tells us we're the ones being hunted. And that's pretty much it. The breakdown feeds back into the chorus, which they loop until it fades out. Over that fade out, they fade in the sound of a woman moaning, because while 80s music is a lot of things, subtle isn't one of them. And that's why I love this song. It knows what it's trying to be, and it goes to completely unnecessary extremes in order to be exactly that thing. It's cute, it's good songwriting, and it is unbelievably 80s. And hey, thanks for watching. Thanks to our Patreon patrons for making these videos possible. And extra special thanks to our featured patrons, Kevin Wilamowski, Susan Jones, Jill Sundgaard, Duck, Howard Levine, Warren Huart, Grant Aldonis, and Damian Fuller Sutherland. If you want to help out and help us pick the next song we analyze too, there's a link to our Patreon on screen now. Oh, and don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.